Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am back after 2 weeks off. Not that you noticed, but I think it was kind of good for me to get away from the mic a little bit. I did record 3 episodes during the 2 weeks I was off, so including the one you're about to hear. And I planned out a bunch of this summer's episodes, so it's not like this was a real vacation or hiatus or anything, but still, I spent a couple of weeks not posting and still put out emails, etc. But I think it was a good break for me. I had some neat times in the past few weeks, especially getting in a few days in LA before a big biotech conference in San Diego, where I wound up meeting and gabbing with the commissioner of the FDA, who just emailed me this morning about something to follow up, which really kind of flipped me out. But that's professional, Gil. The LA trip, that involved some podcasts, as I mentioned, and some visits to past guests to catch up a little, but to shoot Instax pictures for my book, which I'm doing a great job with the Instax pictures. I have to get to work on the writing part of it and the production, etc., before I can start really figuring out what this book's going to be. But anyway, those were good. I got to see Wayne White and Mimi Pond. Jonathan Ames and I had a nice conversation on Sunday morning. But the really neat visit, they were all great, but there was a really neat visit with Joyce Farmer. Joyce had written me a few weeks before this trip, coincidentally, to ask for a favor. Joyce had this legendary career as an underground cartoonist in an era where, A, there weren't a ton of women doing that, and B, what she was doing meant risking getting arrested on obscenity charges back in the 70s in California. And she wrote to tell me she'd been listening to our 2017 conversation, and it got her thinking about how her adult grandkids don't really know much about her and her life. And so she asked if I could burn a CD of the podcast to share with them. Yeah, I could have just sent the URL to email over to them, but maybe she doesn't have their email addresses or whatever. Anyway, I figured I would just do like she asked and also make a thumb drive of the episode and some other files, like the pictures I took when I was at her place. So I drove out there on Saturday morning, and she lives in this wonderful, wonderful area that I'm not going to disclose, but a place that is just kind of mind-blowing in general. This is during my LA trip. And I gave her everything, and we talked for an hour or so, and I took a fantastic picture for the book while I was there. Completely not what I was expecting to take. I thought I was going to shoot some comic art or other stuff she had, but there was this sculpture she had that knocked me the hell out. So that's what I took. But we caught up on the 7-year gap, and in her case, the loss of her husband and climate degradation from where she lives and what it means for her house, and some family stories and all the other stuff that goes to make up a life. And I thought about how much it means that somebody would even want to share that stuff with me. Somebody who I only met once, for an hour or so of conversation years earlier. But I also thought about how that talk, how it was going to be meaningful to her grandkids, that this weird thing that I do can resonate in ways that I never think about for for a little while, I thought about how I have not had that vibe for a long time. This is during that hiatus. I thought, oh, now the show's falling apart. I'm a disaster, etc. And then I just started looking over 2024's episodes and realized, no, I've made a bunch of really strong conversations with people, had a bunch of great guests and things that I think are going to be meaningful for years to come. So anyway, had a bunch of good talks in LA and environs. Visited some art galleries. I got to see some of the collection at LACMA for the first time and had this weirdly transcendent experience with a Frank Stella that I wrote about in my newsletter. And, in theory, I could have either taken one of the shows that I recorded in LA and turned it around immediately once I got to San Diego and, rushed something out or written a monologue and tried to do something. But, I think it was good to just breathe, put on my biopharmaceutical face, be that guy, but also just not rush through everything, to take a little time and be a little more thoughtful. Anyway, I have an insane week ahead, including, and I'm going to do this in sequence, tomorrow is a drive up to Boston to speak at a client event where I may or may not be driving back home the same day, which will be a problem because I'm getting up at 5 a.m. to start this day. Probably stay over and come home Thursday. Friday is an oncology check-in. Saturday is a Catskills mountain hike, which may leave me annihilated for a few days, like the one I did last month. Podcast in New York on Sunday that I still have to finish the reading for. Potentially take my old man out for late lunch on Father's Day. I don't know. We'll see. Down to DC on Monday for what will literally be a 5-minute presentation. Followed on Tuesday by a half day of lobbying on Capitol Hill, maybe a visit to the National Security Council, because weirdly that has become part of my life, and a bunch of other things I'm forgetting. So that'll be next Wednesday through Tuesday, during which time I will get a new episode of the show out again. In the meantime, let's get to this week's show. I apologize for prattling on, but it's been 2 weeks and, you guys want to hear the little Gil Roth catch up, I guess. My guest this time is somebody I have been told for years I need to record with, and I am kicking myself for not doing this earlier, but now we have an occasion to. My guest is Stan Mack, the cartoonist, writer, creator of Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies. This was a comic strip that ran in the Village Voice in New York City from 1974 to 1995. And the reason we're getting together finally, A, because a lot of people browbeat me into it. B, Fantagraphics has this new collection that is out today, June 11th, 2024, for you time travelers out there. Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, the collected conceits, delusions, and hijinks of New Yorkers from 1974 to 1995. Big hardcover, forward by Jake Tapper, collects about 270 of Stan's weekly funnies. Now, you got those years that I just mentioned. As Stan will say, that means there's about 1,000 total strips, but we have about 270 in this book. It's fantastic. What Stan did was he was doing comics journalism at a time that nobody was exactly doing that. The Real Life Funnies strip, he will go into the genesis of it and what it involved and what it meant to do what he was doing. But he was taking real conversations and snippets of dialogue and things he was hearing in New York and sketching them and drawing them out as comics and having these figures. Then he started doing more journalistic things, going to events and kind of chronicling them, and creating a beginning and ending to these events. And then he would start bringing in stories from people, but making sure they were accurate, real, etc. Over the course of, again, 20 plus years of making this strip, he creates this incredible, this chronicle, not of New York, but of New Yorks. There are A, the eras, B, the geography, C, the class issues, and D, a million more factors that I'm not relating here, that he captures week by week, showing us how New York is changing, what the lives of the people who aren't the feature or the focus of journalism and the media, what they're like, what the strange world is like, what sex was like. There's a lot of, we don't get into it, and he mentioned it afterwards. We never even talked about sex. He gets into some of the wackiness of the 70s into the 80s in New York, some of the other aspects of New York City and the fullness of it from, again, the 70s to the mid 90s. The cartooning is fantastic, and what you see over time is how his work changed. We talk about that in terms of how he got more confident as a cartoonist and what it was like for him coming from an art director and illustrator perspective into panel by panel, panel to panel continuity and cartooning, how he learned to see, what he learned to keep and to jettison, how he learned to bring all these little aspects of New York into these comics while bringing the people themselves to life. Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, it was a phenomenal strip at the time, and I didn't appreciate it when I was a kid because I was more in, different comic tastes, to be frank about it. And the Village Voice, I was looking more for sexy ads, frankly, when I would be reading it in the Ringwood Public Library when I was a kid. Now, one of the big issues, we talked about this a few weeks ago when I had D.W. Young on to talk about his new documentary, Uncropped, which is about Village Voice photographer James Hamilton. It's real tough nowadays to find back issues of the Village Voice, and not a lot of the paper has been digitized, which they hope the new ownership is in the process of doing. So it is this really important cultural venue, I guess, what the Village Voice was on a weekly basis, how it chronicled New York and the arts and so many aspects of life that is sort of absent in the digital era, that it's fantastic to see this collection of Stan's work brought to life. Fantagraphics does a great job with the production of this, really substantial hardcover. We joked about how I was going to give myself another neck injury carrying it around New York to do this episode, but it's a really amazing collection, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies. I was so happy once we started talking and I realized I'm continuing Stan's mission. And that was the big thing. I don't think we exactly talk about in the show. We kind of allude to it. What Stan did was, on a weekly basis, go out and evoke someone's story. Either things he would overhear or things he would solicit and go and capture and bring those to an audience. And he did this week after week after week. Didn't take a 2-week hiatus like I just did. But I realized as we were talking, I'm doing what you were doing, just in a different medium, and we have a lot more in common than I thought we did. And this is why people kept saying, you need to sit down with Stan Mack and talk sometime. So I'm kind of a moron at times, but I'm ecstatic that Fantagraphics has this book out. So happy I got to meet Stan and his wife, Susan, to record this show. All I could say is go get Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, the collected conceits, delusions, and hijinks of New Yorkers from 1974 to 1995. Stan's doing some public appearances and readings for the show, for the new book. Go look them up on stanmack.com. Go see him speak. Go thank him for doing what he did, because he captures, like I say, he captures New York's in a lot of different ways. All of this, by the way, does make me think that after recording with D.W. Young and Stan, I really need to try to connect with Tricia Romano, who just did her oral history of the Village Voice. Try to get her on sometime this summer and make it a big Village Voice happening, I guess, to try to kind of remind us all what we're missing and what we were capable of in our best days. Anyway, as caveats go, we were recording in his apartment in New York. Windows were open, so there's some street noise. There's also a little distortion or kind of beeping that comes up sometimes on Stan's channel. To edit it out as best I could, but might be a hearing aid or something like that, or just something electronic in the office that was causing a little disturbance. Anyway, you won't notice it until I point it out. Here's Stan's bio from the book. Stan Mack pioneered a documentary style of cartooning with his notorious New York comic strip, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, which ran in the Village Voice. His Stan Mack's Outtakes for Adweek magazine and Stan Mack's Real Mad for the online publication Media Post cover the world of media. He is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, was a graphic specialist in the Department of Social Sciences at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and is a former art director of the New York Herald Tribune's Book Week, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, and the New York Times Book Review. And now, the Virtual Memories Conversation with Stan Mack.
It's impossible to talk about this book because there's so much in there. Trying to sum it up in any way,
Well, that's right on my first question, which is, what was it like for you revisiting 20-plus years of real-life funnies?
Right. Even though I was there, I did them. And you're left-handed, I see. Seeing the book for the first time, I was as surprised as I think anyone will be, because this thing is so jam-packed. Just doing 1 week at a time is one thing. All you have to do is make that darn deadline. But to look at 20 years in front of you, and every week was somewhere different, so different from the previous, that to see them all together is to have such a wide span of experiences across New York in those days. Anyway, I was as surprised as anyone would be.
Yeah, what was that process for you? I mean, was there an editing moment? I should ask, are there strips that you elected not to include in this one, either for space reasons or maybe things are a little more sensitive now, we're not going to include?
The editing process was tricky.
Yeah.
For one thing, I have close to 1,000 real-life funnies. That's 20 years of weekly strips.
Right.
Most of which I carried them with me, moving from place to place, and I lived in a lot of places. Not very gently. Right now, they're sitting under my bed, but they're more or less in shape. Some of them not so good. And so, how do you edit 1,000 strips when they're so varied? And who's the audience? And what am I doing here anyway?
Yeah.
So, it was tricky. I can only say that I used pure instinct. I guess I was trying to consider the audience and how is this a representation of the era as much as it is of me. So it was really tricky. There are 275 in there, which means that, do the math, 275 minus 1,000, there's still a hell of a lot under my bed, which hasn't seen the light of day. What's the difference? One is some of them are very strange, even though some of the ones in the book are a little bit severe in one way or another. There are some really crazies in there as well, because there were those kind of people in those days that I would come up against, and nothing was off limits. I was totally free to do what I wanted every week. And I was drawn to that. I mean, after all, that was what the world was about. And I was looking for excitement myself.
And the 70s, New York in particular. I mean, I was born in 71. And one of the ongoing jokes I have about this era was that my mother would leave me and my brother in an arcade in Times Square while she went to the 2-for-1 tickets booth, not quite realizing how child protection level of a violation that was, leaving a 10
under arrest.
Yeah, 10 and a 13-year-old in a room full of guys who were nodding off on heroin and everything while we're just trying to get free games on the pinball machines. But yeah, a different New York than it is now, certainly. But it was a world that was a lot more, I would say nihilistic, but
self-actualizing. Yeah, everybody's studying their own belly button in one way or another.
I know Est comes in several times in the book. I was glad.
Yeah, I was definitely fascinated by that whole thing. And I'm just older enough before that this was all grist. I wasn't in the middle of it because I didn't grow up with it in the way somebody 7-10 years younger would have. So this whole thing was quite amazing, and I was there to learn and to experience. When I first started at The Voice, it was owned then by Clay Felker, and Milton Glaser was redesigning it. These were not Voice people at all. These guys were Uptown and New York Magazine and all of that. So when we agreed to do this strip, Glaser and I, to do it, suggested it to him, and he said, great idea. I thought of one shot. And he said, cartoon strips are circulation builders. Why don't you do it every week? And I thought, every week? Are you crazy? I mean, one person is going to go out into that world and come back with something interesting every week. So I said yes. Anyway, so Clay Felker says, why don't you go to Bloomingdale's? Clay Felker is all about the Upper East Side.
Yeah.
So I said, okay. So I went to Bloomingdale's, and I did something. You want to get the attention of salespeople at Bloomingdale's, hang out without buying anything. And I came back with the strip. But I also realized, I have a story about how it was named, if you're interested.
Yeah.
But I realized that Bloomingdale's was too easy, man. What's the problem? Just go and wander around. If I'm going to do this every week, it's really going to have to be challenging. I'm going to have to get outside my comfort zone and go someplace where it feels a bit like an adventure. That's what New York is. So that was the tip-off to me that I had to go sort of into these other places you're talking about. Not necessarily physical front lines. It wasn't a war zone. But in a way, it was a psychological.
Yeah. We'll go with that.
Yeah. Okay. So should I tell you how the strip came about? I mean, the title of it?
Sure.
So I deliver at Bloomingdale's. And remember that Clay Felker and Milton Glaser are not true voice people. I mean, these guys came out of Greenwich Village in late 50s and early 60s. It was revolutionary times. They were like that. And I come out with this thing, and they say, what is this? And I said, well, because Milton said, run it. So, but they said, what is this? And I said, well, it's, I went to Bloomingdale's, and these are real people. I sketched them, and these are their real words. And they said, what are you talking about? This is a comic strip. Comic strips are fiction. Yeah. You're telling us that this is all, we can't fact check. How do we know what you're saying is accurate at all? This is the Village Voice. I said, I don't know, call it whatever you want, but that's the case. And they said, well, we can call it real life funnies. Why funnies instead of comics? I'm not even sure. Yeah. Funnies is newspapers and comics are comic books. You know, who knows what was in their head? Okay, real life funnies. But then they said, but that Pfeiffer you could call real life funnies if you felt like it. It was New York during his era, real life. Why don't we guarantee that everything you're telling us is real, really is? So we'll call it guaranteed verbatim. Yeah. They love the word verbatim. I had to look it up. Yeah. And then they said, well, wait a minute. Who's guaranteeing it? We can't. We weren't there. We're going to have Stan Mack guarantee it. So we're going to put his name big up front. And that's how this thing came about.
Inadvertent branding. That's,
Inadvertent, as far as I was concerned.
Yeah. One of the neat things with the book, you break out, the chapters are basically 2-year increments.
Yes.
Each one of which you provide an introduction for. And you sort of, in addition to mentioning a couple of the strips that'll be in there, you also sort of talk about your own evolution and your evolution, how the strip itself changed, how you were changing and how New York was changing within it. How much of that was in your head versus how much you had to really start, reviewing all the pages and realizing, here's where things started to get weird, or here's where I moved into. Because to me, one of the big things is you move away from the mosaic, fragmentary style where it's just snippets of people talking into those more narrative pieces. Yes. That comes a bit later in the process. But tell me about just those biannual introductions and, your way of marking time as you were looking through 20 years of
You're right.
real life.
I had to look back to come to some of the conclusions that are in those intros. But I realized that I was really looking at, in retrospect, a history, you might say, not only of New York, but the boomers, the 70s and 80s. But at the time, I had come from, I had been an art director at the New York Herald Tribune, my first important job in New York. I'd come from Rhode Island. This was all new to me. And then I moved, when the Trib folded, I went to the New York Times as an art director, finishing up with being the art director of New York Times Sunday Magazine. And it was at that point that I realized I was beginning to repeat myself. The Trib was so exciting compared to where the Times was and trying to be more than, that I thought, I'm not really a corporate person. I'm going to move on. I'll go back to what I was doing anyway, which was freelance illustration. So that was the background. But when I started to do the comics, I had a background in newspapers. I understood Jimmy Breslin and Tom Wolfe and Pete Hamill and Gloria Steinem. These were people I was editing all the time in order to be able to illustrate their pieces. I had to become, in a sense, part of what they used to call the new still do, call the new journalism.
Yeah.
Which is to say, in a way, using some of the tools of the fiction writer in approaching the old-fashioned idea of who, where, when, of traditional newspaper reporting. So when I started The Voice, I had that in my background. I knew, for example, I'm going to be someplace different every week. Therefore, that first panel, it's a comic strip, mostly it's in panels, had to tell you, the reader, where you are.
Right.
Not where I was last week. So it had to say where, what's going on, and be an introduction to the event I'm at. So all of that had to be synthesized in what they would have called a lead in the newspaper piece. So that's what I knew. But did I know I was covering the 70s New York City? I did, in a sense, of course. I was drawn to it, but that was instinct. I wasn't evaluating it and saying, what am I doing here? Let's see, I am taking a picture of...
Because you would have lost your mind. You would have been paralyzed by the responsibility, I think, of I am the reporting titan of comic strips and The Voice.
I would have been paralyzed not only by that, but if I thought it was getting popular. I would have been very vulnerable to that.
I wonder, what was the moment when you realized you had an audience?
It was subtle, and it was slow arriving. But one event I remember was one of the editors came back from, and this was early on, came back from some sort of a trip to the Southwest. And she's sitting in a public restroom on the throne. And she looks up, and on the door facing her is one of my comic strips. I don't know which one.
Yeah.
But I thought, whoa. That's major. That's like, that's email. That's...
Yeah. You're going viral.
Facebook, it's viral.
Another way. Yeah.
So that. And then a couple of reporters, Paul Cowan died far too young of cancer, possibly as a result of covering some of the nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
Said to me, he comes from he lived in the Upper West Side, and he said, people are asking about this person who's doing this comic strip. But, none of that was impacting me because I couldn't deal with it.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to know about it. Who was out there? Who was reading it? Until little by little, I would get a note from somebody saying, that panel you did last week where there's a guy with a beard and a funny hat? That was me. Or that was my friend. Could you sign
do an autograph of a strip?
Yeah. So, but even then, man, that deadline was deadly.
Yeah.
And as you suggest with your work, you didn't always get what you wanted the first time around. So I would have a strip that didn't work. Luckily, I had a folder called Overheard Dialogue that I would slip stuff into from time to time. Whenever I caught a line going by, but didn't relate to anything I was doing, I stuck it in this folder. So when the strip of that week didn't work, and something had to show up, I would turn to that folder and do a collection. Yeah. 6 or 10 different moments around New York. But what I always did was I went to the place, I thought I overheard it in the first place, and drew as accurate as I could 2 things. What the background looked like, what street sign was there, and, if possible, what the people walking by looked like and were dressed like. Because if it was the East Village, it was not going to look like the Upper East Side. No way. You can always tell the difference. So I tried that way to make it as accurate as possible.
Favorite neighborhood, building, environment, whatever, for drawing?
Oh, I just love the city.
Yeah? I wasn't sure if you had one particular, I love when something happens in this neighborhood because I get to draw.
No, every street corner... had its own character, whether it's East Village, Upper West Side, Tribeca. As long as I could get something that looked to me drawable and accurate, it really, every part of the city was grist. I didn't have any, because it was the same thing. If an ambulance goes by, it's the same ambulance. Yeah. Policemen jump out of a police car to go do something. that was the same. Whatever.
Beat up a guy for drinking a Zima. Yeah.
Oh, you saw that? Sure. That's my wife's favorite.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of one where you had the elevated line above, and the way you did the shadow and just the panes of the sunlight coming through it. It was just one of those. I'm sure he loved this, and I've only seen this once in the entire book. He must just absorb the city in its entirety.
I confess, I look at those drawings now and say, how did I do it?
That was my next question.
I do not know how because I was at the same time doing some illustration work. I did a couple of kids' books.
Yeah.
And I was doing from 81 to 91 a similar real life funny for Adweek magazine called Outtakes, doing the exact same thing. It was always about the media or advertising primarily. But I look at those drawings and go, well, it's not bad. At the time, I thought I was just squeaking through. And I look at some and go, you weren't at your best, but I understand why you had to get it in.
What did you get better at as the first couple of years? For me, I like this show. It's all about reps. Once you start to do it a few times, you start to figure out, you start to improve just on your own. What was the learning curve for you when you look back at some of these with this is where I figured out, how to do X, Y, or Z?
The learning curve was
the deadline's a great thing. Trust me, the deadline will make you learn in a big hurry. But
yes, yeah, there was always that.
Yeah.
But the learning curve actually was two curves in a way, made me a little nervous. At the beginning, I didn't know what I was doing. It was raw copy. I knew a couple of things. I loved to draw. Certain lines that would go by me, I wanted to grab, and other lines I totally ignore. Why? Yeah. I wasn't a writer. I had no background in writing. Why some lines jumped out and some I had no use for. Earl Wilbell, who was Ubell, sorry, was a science writer at the Trib, said to me, "Oh, you do epiphanies." I had to go look up that word too. Yeah. I didn't know what it was, but that was how it started. It was raw stuff. Gradually, I became more sophisticated, began to understand what I was doing, and so at first I would go into an event. I would join the Unitarian Church, the singles again, crowd. We would sit around the circle, and all would reveal their personal issues, and in the hope of meeting somebody, which included me, because I would.
You were playing along and
make up stuff.
Yeah,
you couldn't do it as press, but I gradually thought, well, okay, it's not just raw. It's not just a dump truck.
Yeah.
Which I back up to the page and unload stuff. This has to have some coherence to it. So I did, beginning and end. If you come into an event someplace, you're going out someplace, even if the middle is mainly just overheard stuff. And so that evolved into storylines. I learned that there ought to be a dramatic something somewhere between the first panel and the last. And that the last panel should link in some way to the first, but in effect, not leave you hanging, but say goodbye to you, and you would be comfortable with that. So over time, and then it became something about, well, if I could cut, basically I was covering the herd, the New York herd.
Yeah.
If I could cut one of those people from the herd and isolate them and sit with them, I would be much more satisfied because I'd be digging deeper into these epiphanies to find out where that came from.
Right.
So I was becoming more sophisticated as a reporter, eventually, even with a press card from The Voice. I wondered whether I was also losing something from those early days, some of the energy.
In terms of I'll say artifice, like artificial in terms of just the fact that it's more edited, or
which I was doing.
Yeah. I mean, you had to from the outset, but you're more conscious of the editing. It sounds like.
I think that's exactly right.
Crafting.
Yeah. So as I became more of a craftsman, was I losing some of that initial rawness? So you're right. It was a curve, and hopefully it was going up. I got to a point later in the history of the strip where I was loading up the strip with words. I didn't have an editor. I was my own editor, which is not a good thing. But it did always have that quality of being drawn, words being picked up along the way, drawn on the subway on the way to the Voice. And if some dirt got on the paper, all the better. But I began to think towards the end, there was no term such as graphic novel in those days. I mean, I was all by myself out there. There was nothing like it for years. But what am I really anticipating when I now look back and wonder about? Could those strips be the roots of what could be a graphic nonfiction work today? So there was that kind of evolution, and it was just me going with the flow, not really understanding. I did understand there were some changes going on in the city. For example, the entry of the so-called yuppie, which is a brand new word and coined in those days. I even did two full-size posters, the male yuppie and the female yuppie, and what characterized them. Well, they were, it seemed to me, the older siblings of the early 70s boomers. But they were entirely different. They were showing up in New York with MBAs. I was aware, and then AIDS hit. I was aware that the world around me had dramatically changed, and that I was, in some sense, picking up on the change.
When you mentioned that sort of proto-graphic novel idea, most of the people you talk about interacting with, professionals, are all writers. You mentioned Breslin and Hamill and people like that. Did cartoonists start reaching out, or did you hear from other artists?
I didn't have a real cartoonist's background.
That's why I wonder whether people were like, "Oh, hey, I've been checking out your strip," and
no,
because I didn't get that vibe. I'm glad you supported that. Okay.
Not at all. In fact, I wondered what cartoonists made of it, because I didn't have any.
You're not coming from a comics.
I read comics, loved comics as a kid, read the Sunday Funnies as a kid, loved it. Never occurred to me to be a cartoonist. Came to New York to be an illustrator. RISD didn't even have, there was no such thing as cartoon majors in those days. Went to RISD, came to New York figuring I was going to be an illustrator. Well, there's no way my goofy, scratchy line would have ever been accepted if it had still been the 50s. I went to RISD in the late 50s. But it was part of that line was part of the revolution, in a way, the graphics revolution, which Milton Glaser, of course, was at the center of, as were the underground comics, neither of whom I had anything to do with. Well, I was a graphic designer. I was an art director at the newspaper.
I was just incredibly thankful from the introduction of the book that you and I actually do have something in common, which is Milton gave you the great idea. In your case, it was doing this as a weekly strip. In my case, Milton and I recorded about a year before he died, and he got exactly what I'm doing by the end of it. He was like, oh, when you make the book, what you need to do, don't just run long transcripts of individual guests. Get the themes from each of the various guests and, start collating those and figuring out which ones are about work or about love or about this and that, and use those great pictures that you're taking of the artist. I'm like, you're Milton Glaser. You're a friggin' genius. And I'm just some schlub with a couple of microphones. You saw exactly what a project out of this podcast should look like within an hour of meeting me and sitting through one of these. So
you could tell you just told my story.
Yeah. That was the moment I read the intro. I'm like, he knows exactly where I'm coming from, because Milton saw what you were doing and saw what it needs to be.
Yeah. And there was no reason for that. I knew him, and I knew Clay Felker too. Clay Felker had been at the Trib.
Yeah.
So I was aware of him, and then I was doing a lot of illustration work. I did a lot of illustration. In those days, there was work available the way there isn't today. So he knew what I drew like. But the reason this whole thing came about was I had been experimenting with the idea of illustrators covering events, going out from behind the drawing board and go out into the world. And I began to assign them as an art director on the magazine, including even assigning myself to go along with reporters at the Times, and
supplement
my illustrations,
or
even overhearing, and my illustrations sometimes were in panel shapes. So when I went back to illustration, quit the Times, I thought, all right, now I'm waiting for the phone to ring for some agent to find an illustration job. Why can't I create something? I wasn't enough of a writer to be able to pitch stories. I was basically an illustrator. What could I do? Well, I had done enough assigning of others to do this, and I thought, well, I could do it. Why don't I come up with an idea? And New York is my world. Why don't I wander around town? This is exactly what I said to Milton. Why don't I wander around town, pick up what people are saying, talk to them a little bit, illustrate it, and do a piece. One piece.
Nope. Weekly. And he saw exactly what you had and what it could be.
Exactly.
That's why he was a genius, and we're getting by.
One of the schlubs is what I was. Even though the voice itself, as forward-thinking as they were, how adventurous as they were, breaking news as they were about the changing culture of the city, way ahead of certainly the Times, but everybody. They're way ahead of it. This book, The Freaks, came out to write.
I've heard it's great. I haven't read it yet.
It's terrific. I have it here. I'm halfway through it, but well enough into it to realize that it, too, is putting me into the picture of what the voice was. I didn't understand because I wasn't a huge voice fan. Mm-hmm. I was trying to break it into the mainstream as an illustrator.
Yeah.
I wasn't a teenager reading The Voice. And yet there it was. The way she lays it out, I can put myself into
the context of it all.
Yeah.
It's funny. I talked about this when I recorded with D.W. Young. He just did that documentary about James Hamilton, the photographer, and the voice of that 70s and 80s
I just
into
saw the
90s.
film.
I enjoyed it. And I was very glad that one of your strips shows up when somebody's opening a copy of The Village Voice. I'm like, oh, there's Stan's comic. The sense of... Well, comparing this to, there's a documentary about the New York Review of books, and it manages not to mention David Levine at all. And I just had this moment of like, oh, he's kind of integral to the entire identity of this thing you're championing. You should probably have mentioned him. So I'm so glad to see with The Voice that there's more of a sense of, yes, these artists were part of the thing. They weren't just, tacked onto the voice. They meant something to its identity. To
an extent, but there's a hint of what you just said about the New York Review of Books at The Voice. Pfeiffer was there because he was there. There was something about comics that worked, but he was an original. He was an original member of The Voice. Where he did work for free just to get it on the paper. And as a cartoonist, he was unique.
Right.
Broke ground, didn't exist before. But that was it until Glazer showed up. They would, from time to time, have comics of various kinds, one-shots.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether they were as sensitive to the visual side. And the photographers were terrific. James Hamilton.
But it's the same era as you. He's coming in the very late 60s, I think, and you're starting a few years later. With that.
Really, the 70s, according to Tricia, was probably and maybe the 80s, was the golden age of The Voice, even though they were important before and after. Of course. But, for example, and then Mark Stamety came along after me, and then there were others.
Ben Catcher and a few others.
Ben is an example of somebody who should not have not been there. He only lasted I don't know exactly how long, but who was more New York?
Yeah, and to me, when you mention epiphanies, that's exactly what those Julius Knipple strips were like. It's just the fictionalized, amazing, weird version of what you're doing and a different visual style and everything else. But
and yet,
New York.
Exactly. And yet he didn't survive. And I think there was a blind spot at The Voice for the visual. I say the same thing about the people who are taking their words as innovative and important and unusual, revolutionary as they were, had to be designed into the newspaper in a way that was forward-thinking itself.
Yeah.
You weren't going to do it like the New York Times of 1940. They were doing something really important. And as you suggest, maybe they should be more acknowledged than the equivalent of David Levine.
Yeah. I found it funny in the book. I mean, you have to literally make an explanation for why the format of the strip changes. How they just, they told me this is the new shape of the comic, and now I was compressed and taller, and I was just jamming more words in, and it becomes a very different thing.
Nobody, as much as I'm promoting the visual, the art directors, the designers,
It can be arbitrary.
Nobody asked me.
Yeah.
And the problem was, the more space they gave me, first of all, it was a weird shape. Yeah. The Pfeiffer shape that
the two tiers kind of more
that
horizontal.
kind of worked.
Yeah.
But when you make it a square, what the heck is it?
Yeah.
And I just kept loading it up with words. And that was a time when I was drawn to the idea of squatting. I was going over to the East Village, doing some fairly serious stuff in an unmanageable shape.
Yeah.
So
it would seem that the shape of the panels at that point is dictating what you can do visually. I'll say in the early ones, and this is part of what I'm wondering about your artistic evolution or your drawing evolution, there's more full figures in the earlier strips. You're drawing people full height, and over time you start putting in less of them because you don't have to put in the full body standing there talking. You can convey more of them with less.
In a sense, I was becoming more of a cartoonist. In the early days, I always sketch from life. Later on, I began to take snapshots too. There was no phones in those days.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I drew. And I drew secretly because for the most part, you don't walk around in a pad. You see some art students.
Trust me, I was doing it on the sidewalk before I came here when I was having my coffee. I got maybe 30 seconds into it before somebody either noticed or walked away on their own anyway. So, but yeah.
I taught life drawing at SVA for a few years.
Yeah.
I loved it. It was my favorite subject back at RISD. And that's what I started doing. If you look at the cover of the book, it's full figures. You're exactly right. But as time went on, and because I had great fun doing that, and they were all caricatured. It wasn't just face caricatures, it was body caricatures, which people don't talk about as much, because I've got this little pad, and I'm writing down secretly what people are saying. If I'm sitting in that circle in the rap session, nobody wants to know they're being
taking
recorded.
Notes on them, yeah.
So it's quite, and I'm also sketching as well as I can, but that means instantaneous, seconds worth of sketching. When I got back to the studio, and I would clip my little sayings, my little the words I overheard, and paste them up on a wall, along with these little doodles, to try to figure out in the early days what the heck where was I? What was this really about? So those little doodles became the drawings. Yeah. So they have that kind of caricature quality. And you're right, I wanted the whole figure. That was life drawing. Yeah. But as I evolved into you might call it a cartoonist, really. The message, the story, what you just said was you were zeroing in. I used to say the more people talked, the shorter they got. So there was that change too, which I wasn't even aware of at first, that the later strips are in tighter.
And there's camera angles. In a sense, early on, you're sort of looking at a flat picture plane with some of them, and over time, you start canting and figuring out.
Moving the camera.
Same thing. What we should be looking at.
Yeah.
Who are the cartooning influences? I mean, there's so many people I see in your scratchy lines that I either who came before or after you, and I just have this. Boy, I wonder who actually influenced
me.
Yeah.
Not many.
Yeah.
In the cartooning world at all. I mean, I read Pogo, I read Peanuts, I read everybody.
You don't have a Walt Kelly line in this visually, I mean.
I look at Walt Kelly. I was very envious of other artists' work who didn't look anything like me. Walt Kelly. Tommy Ungra, you remember him?
Oh, gosh, yeah. I had a connection to him, but didn't push it well enough to sit down with him. You do this long enough and you regret the people you didn't get to. Tommy Ungerer is one of those people that I feel like, oh God, I really should have pushed and actually. Yeah.
There were people I really admire. Robert Weaver, who was an illustrator out of the 50s, who just did stuff that I was amazed by. Ben Shawn was another one. But I'm giving you the names of people I didn't pattern myself after because they were so different. I just admire the hell out of them.
Yeah.
But who did I think of as a kid, for example? Willard Mullen. Do you know that name?
Yeah.
Premier sports cartoonist, the best who will ever have done it.
Yeah.
But they don't have sports cartoonists anymore. Willard Mullen. And then I would go back into history because in the history of illustration we touched on people like Hogarth and Cruikshank And those certainly were true. And Bill Malden,
Sure.
who did real life funnies, Covered But Mud. I don't know how he did that, but it was brilliant. And it was him down with the grunts, which was in my head always. I don't have any.
Yeah, when Fantagraphics sent those 2-volume slipcase of Malden's war comics, it's just one of those. Yeah, in the trenches and coming out with these incredible pieces.
Basically small moments, which is how I view what I always did. Yeah. If there were politics, about AIDS, about sex, about anything, women's movement, any of that stuff, it came by me talking to people. For some reason, I was drawn to them, and out of that, you get the sense of that larger political stuff. But if I didn't stay down on the sidewalk, it wasn't working. And
that's really what I got, especially the later years in this book. The amount of time, as you mentioned, the squatter situation and Tompkins Park and everything else, and really being in this world. It'd be easy for you to hang out at Bloomingdale's. I'll put it that way. It would be very easy to do, I'm going to hang out in an art gallery in the Upper East Side and get an idea of the city. But you put yourself in some situations.
It had to come through as an edge. Can I tell you, I'll try to make it quickly, one story about the squatter movement. I made friends with Bobby Fuller, who ran the Hobo Theater Company out of one of the squats, and all the actors were homeless. He was a real serious activist and a great guy. So I would hang out with him. So we were across the street on 10th Street from Tompkins Square Park, where the police were rousting all the homeless. It was a huge movement in that direction at that moment. And a bunch of activists, young guys, come running by us, and Bobby said, where are you going? And they said, we're going to occupy this warehouse building. There were a lot of warehouse buildings in those days, which is why the squatters were there. The city didn't know what to do with them. The landlords had left because they couldn't keep them up. And the guy said, we're going to occupy this building, and we're going to hang banners outside attacking the police and the city and the mayor and so on. Bobby said, can we go along? They said, sure, come on. So all of us rushed up the stairs. It was the second or third floor. They barricaded themselves in a back apartment to hang out the banners, and the cops spot it all, and they come running across up the stairs. They're screaming. They're going to open the door. They're going to break it down. They're going to arrest everybody. Now, I won't say why at the moment, but Bobby was wearing a kind of a scarf-like thing around his chest, and he says, I can't be arrested. And I said, I got to get out of here. And I said, well, it's not going to do my story. So even though I don't appear in the comic strip, I was there. We jump out the window. We clamber down over a rooftop, end up on the roof of a one-story garage around the corner on Avenue B, jump down. I pull out my iPad like I'm just covering everything. Bobby runs to the phone booth at the corner, and he calls up Mary Beth, and he says, and then we realize what's in this wrap he's had on his jet. He's got a 2-month-old baby, his and Mary Beth's, the mother. He calls her up and says, Mary Beth, I couldn't get arrested because I don't have enough formula
for the baby.
For the baby, who I did not name, but her name was Chea, after Che Guevara. Gives you an idea of the politics of Chea's parents. But that's only the beginning of the story. I lost track of Chea totally. I went on. They disappeared. Bobby died very young of bone cancer. It was very sad. And that was it. Now, 30 years later, almost exactly, during COVID, I'm in Los Angeles. I lived there during part of that. I get a phone call from Angel, a tattoo artist in Austin, Texas, who says, I'm having a 30th birthday party for my wife, Chea. Will you come on Zoom to do it? And it's Chea. All those years later, and she said to me, it was a wonderful moment. She said to me later, I didn't know my father very well. He was gone before I grew up. But your comic strips, which my mother saved, were my family album. So that's... really powerful. Every once in a while, that kind of thing happened in the strips.
When we talk about that sense of, again, discovering you have an audience and that your work is meaningful to other people, Well, say during COVID, I had the experience during that early lockdown phase, about 2 weeks in, I just started doing these remotely with past guests. We'd connect online. I'd record 20 or 30 minutes of, how are you doing? And this is March, April, May 2020, when we're all in that phase. And I would just post them the next morning, each one. I did about 60 of these over a little over 60 days. And it was meaningful. People, in the condition we were all in, where everybody is in lockdown, people had I get to hear how this artist or this writer or how Gil's doing. And it became something to them. But the idea that you had this longevity where it meant something to somebody 30 years later, that it was part of her upbringing in life.
I did turn from time to time to somebody who had been in a strip a little earlier.
Yeah.
And do a follow-up for just the reasons you're describing.
Tell me about bringing yourself in to the strip visually. And I notice you don't have the bushy mustache that you...
No, and my nose isn't quite square, but it's big enough.
That, by the way, when we talk about visual influences, and I see, the Ed Sorel and various other things in your line, the boxy nose always reminds me of the comic strip Reed Fleming, World's Toughest Milkman, that this guy in Vancouver used to do. And his complaint was, when I saw him in an event about 15 years ago, if I'd known that the strip was going to take off, I wouldn't have given him that nose because it's impossible to draw. And I'd wondered about the boxy nose also.
No, it was the opposite for me. It was easy to draw.
Really? Okay, because he really had to do this at these crazy angles.
Well, but anybody can draw a square.
Yeah, but all the little shading. But anyway, the idea of putting yourself into the strip, introducing yourself as a character.
If necessary, eventually I figured out that I would have to, from time to time, be the punchline. And so it was that simple. If I was at loose ends where I was going, I was there.
Yeah.
Not that it was my words. It was never my words.
Sure. You're always the listener, recorder. You're accompanying whoever's talking. Yeah.
There were, I found out, others who assigned reporting events to illustrators, but I don't know the results. Any of those results ever had a totally wordless character in it.
I'm thinking about when Art Spiegelman was the art director at Details, and he would do those crazy. You'd send Ben Catcher to cover a surfing competition, just weird combinations like that. But
did Ben speak? I don't even.
No, but everything is in those captions of Ben, so he's basically speaking, as the narrator throughout. So,
I had to. I knew I wanted to avoid narration. This was going to be entirely a movie with people speaking.
Yeah.
So there was no way my voice was going to show up.
In that respect, were there cinematic influences even more than cartooning for you?
Well, you mentioned before moving the camera around.
Yeah.
It became clear that I had a story to tell. For the most part, I didn't move the camera around a lot. I would go do a long shot. So I could capture the neighborhood, tell people where.
Or Madison Square Garden, you're going to show the whole crowd and
right. Yeah. Or there's some signage, store signs down the street to where the action is taking place. And I would pull back. And sometimes, Ron Hauge. He was, this gets at another point too. Were you always there? Obviously I wasn't always there. He was mugged. He lived on Avenue B and 13th Street when he didn't have any money, and and we're good friends. And he told me about the story, and I thought, if somebody is willing, and this happened from time to time in the strip, if somebody was willing to let me browbeat them and make sure I had every detail right, and I thought the story was wonderful, I would do it. And Ron allowed that to happen. Yeah. So I did.
A 2-part strip of him getting mugged.
A 2-part strip. I love that one, actually. And Ron says he's been caricatured because he became an important writer. Seinfeld.
Yeah.
He became important, and he would, from time to time, be caricatured. He said nobody captured him like that comic strip does. But at the end, now I made it clear that it was the corner of 13th Street and Avenue B. But in the last panel, I pulled back to suggest where his apartment was, and maybe that's me hanging out. So maybe it's a conceit.
Kind of there.
Maybe I overheard.
You talk about your politics when you mentioned, again, covering some of the movements that you covered throughout the 80s. The 80s in particular. The 70s were weirdly, not just you and the Strip. I mean, it was a weird political time.
Yeah.
But, where were you coming from politically? How did that change through doing this?
Well, I was always for the loser, the guy who was being taken advantage of. I don't know where that came from. There's some social workers back in my family, but basically apolitical in the 50s. That's who you were in the 50s. You didn't, well, if you were a baby, then you were a boomer. But I was from before that, so I didn't have any politics, especially to begin with, except I was always for the guy who was being taken advantage of one way or another. So that was where it's all started. And I wasn't drawn to the Upper East Side, which is money to some extent. I was drawn to downtown, where I don't know. As you say, the 70s was crazy.
There's more life.
My politics began to become much stronger later on. Was it because I was part of The Voice by then? And their politics? Was it because my own politics were becoming more clear in the strips? Probably that, certainly. Because by that time, I was very much, I think, seen as a Voice political writer, I think. With the strips, I mean.
Yeah, they had a social realism, a social reality to them. In a time it was a very conflicted, it was a New York that was going through a lot, and a world that was going through a lot.
Well, and also, if you think about my roots, in my history of illustration class in RISD, the Ashcan School was very significant for me. I was just fascinated by the idea of people covering the world from the street. And that's what it was. And that, to a great extent, was the immigrant world. And my grandparents and great-grandparents would have been part of that world. So that was in my blood someplace. But how it all came together, why it came together, it just was the downtrodden. Was somehow I found humanity, and I was able to cover the shareholders at the Con Edison shareholder meeting, and people down on Wall Street. It wasn't like I didn't go there. I did, but it was easier to make fun of them. If money showed up, I was making fun of it. I realized that I couldn't follow the money. I had to follow the people. Mm-hmm. If they got to the money, there was more satire in it than the other way.
You have the one of the yuppies at the art gallery, looking to buy something, and it immediately turns into the investment aspect of it. And when you go with full figure drawings, the gigantic pleats of the art gallery attendant or the salesman, whoever he is, it was just one of those touches. I'm like, that's 1986 right there.
Yeah.
you capture what that looked like perfectly.
I know what you're talking about, and that's what happened. There was money everywhere.
Yeah.
Among the rich, and along with that came big baggy clothes, whether it's just power shoulders or oversized overcoats that people would use as a fashion statement. So bagginess was definitely a sign of the change that was taking place.
Did the observation predate the comic, or did you become a better observer by necessity? Were you always kind of noting these things without quite realizing it? And I mean, whatever the trends were, 60s, et cetera.
It was all coming from inside. I never intellectualized.
Yeah, I just mean, did you find that as you were drawing these things, you were just observing more tightly, what you were seeing?
I think that was the evolution of me. You said the evolution of the strip and the arc. It was definitely me waking up to who I was at the same time. And maybe I was a little weirder in the 70s and less political.
You do mention also more, well, the way we all are, maybe less sensitive to other human beings and where they were coming from in the early... You're having more of a laugh at some of the excesses of people's behavior back then, where now it's that guy had a life too. You became a little more sensitive, not in a PC way, but more human.
You're nailing all these things. You're right. I began to worry that maybe I was becoming too empathetic. In the early days, I wasn't at all. I was making fun of everybody.
Yeah.
I wasn't a New Yorker. It was all ridiculous. It all seemed silly. Go for it. I was an outsider. I just arrived from the moon or Mars. So, yes. And do you get to a point where empathy becomes too important for you to do your job?
Gotcha. Yeah, when did you feel you were a New Yorker? Do you feel you're a New Yorker?
I'm not from New York. Not that I love Providence, but I know I'm not a New Yorker. I think that's true of all New Yorkers who came from someplace else.
Yeah.
Depending on your confidence level and what you're doing, you can decide, I am, or I am, but really not. So I think I'm probably in that category. I'm a New Yorker. I moved to L.A. for a time to work on my memoir, Janet and Me, with the help of a friend who later became my wife, Susan Champlin. Yeah. And so when I told people I was moving to L.A., they said, "You're the epitome of a New Yorker. I can't even imagine you not being in New York."
That is when you realized you were a New Yorker. Okay.
Well, I wasn't
you
quite.
Didn't realize,
but yeah, really didn't.
They did. Yeah. Yeah. I my LA experiences are funny, and I'll be there next weekend. I go usually when I have a trade show in San Diego, as I do this time. I'll go the weekend before. All I do is drive around and record a bunch of podcasts with people. And then I head down to San Diego and turn into biopharmaceutical lobbyist guy for several days. And it's the idea that nothing is a walk in LA. Everything is.
Well, if you put on your walking costume.
Yeah. Then they'll think you're crazy.
And you have your route. You can walk purposefully.
Yeah. But otherwise, no, it's a city where, as one of my guests put it, it's all neighborhoods, and only the bus drivers know the city. But
and they don't know the top half of the population, or
right, they only know the people who would be on the buses in those neighborhoods.
Well, there are now subways.
Yeah, I've heard downtown LA actually has a subway area. There's a little bit.
I've been on a couple of them, but it's a little strange.
Yeah. In fact, one of your subjects in here, Wayne White, is who appears in one of your 80s strips, is one of my past guests who I recorded with out there. Supposed to drop in on him and Mimi Pond at some point during the weekend that I'll be out there. So I will send you regards in case.
Please do.
My God, Stan Mack.
I just had coffee with Mimi. She was here.
I saw she had posted about being in New York.
Yeah, we met briefly.
Yeah, do you? How much do you stay in touch with people you'd met through through Real Life Funnies?
Not much. There are so many of them.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
and a few have become friends, but not especially that way. A few I've reconnected with because of the book, because I've been talking about it on social media, on Facebook especially, and they too are on it, and so we've kind of reconnected, and it's fun to do that. Yeah. And then there are some people I revisited from time to time, but by the way, getting back to punchline business, you may remember the Lionel Richie comic in the book where I became the punchline. Yeah. This was a hip Latin crowd who were backing him up. A music video by Bob Giraldi, whose name you might know as well, and it was in L.A. I said, Bob, whom I knew, I said, "Can I go along? You're shooting this running in the night, running."
Yeah. That's a Lionel Richie song. Yeah. I think it's Running in the Night. Yeah.
And so they were doing that, and they needed one extra. I'm sorry, I got away from what we were talking about before. They needed an extra. They were short one dancer, hip Latin dancer. He said, "Can you do it?" So I got in and tried. And he said afterwards, Stan, if you don't mind, you're a bit of I forget what word he used for me, but it wasn't cool. Yeah. We're going to substitute the son of the guy who's playing the priest. Yeah. Will take your place. And so I became the doofus who didn't make it. It was the punchline. But it worked very well, and it was more or less accurate.
The work takes you in a lot of places. You ended up encountering a life you would not have encountered without, which is, again, everything I do here, except you were doing it for a real audience as opposed to, me making a podcast. You were getting paid, I'll put it that way.
Getting paid well enough to keep it going, although that wasn't the reason to do it. I mean, this was a gig, a column. I had come to admire columnists in newspapers. And all of a sudden, I had something that was way beyond anything I would have fantasized even. I had a column, a weekly column in the Village Voice.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yep.
So that was part of it.
But yeah, it's the idea of having to, well, I refer to the columnist curse every so often. It's basically if you have a weekly column, the longer you go on, the closer you come to saying, I'm not saying Hitler was right, but, you know, so, and that's the point at which you have to stop making your column. The idea that you're able to find the scenarios, the people, the words, and still, you know, make them stand out visually. Because as Jake Tapper says in the introduction, you may fixate on the dialogue of these things, but, you know, don't skimp on looking at the art. Make sure you get what's going on. You did a lot more than a lot of other columnists have done, and you didn't praise Hitler at any point, so that's a plus.
I don't think Hitler shows up there anywhere. Yeah, I did. We were talking about how some people would show up a second or third time.
Yeah.
Did you notice the Rugman series?
Yes, the Rugman shows up, not just the 2 times. There's another one where he appears at least.
I think there's 3 of them. Yeah. I originally heard about him through a friend who was on her way to the movie, Hannah and Her Friends. Remember that?
Hannah and Her Sisters.
Her sisters, yes.
Yeah.
She and her husband. And she steps on a rug remnant on the way to the theater. And it turns out there's a guy rolled up in
And
there.
it grunts, yeah.
You remember? Well, he said it was performance art. It was more than that. He had a hang-up about being stepped on. It was weird. Anyway, she agreed to come over to the apartment. I was living on 13th Street at the time, right next to the new school. So she came over, Janet, and I sat with her and went through all of her experience very carefully. And I knew well enough exactly what happened, so I did the strip. And it caught people's attention because it was so classically weird for the Village Voice, for the Village. And I bumped into him a couple years later, a couple more times, and what came out was a little bit more of the psychology, more of the background. He explained what was in this for him. Although he became well known enough then that people were asking him to lie inside a rug on the way to their party.
Yeah.
Or behind the bar, so that the bartender would be. And
she'd be dancing on top of it.
She was delivering drinks, running back, and he loved it. But he did. He even thought about whether he could do Jane Fonda like
aerobic video
videos. He had an idea for doing a step video where he would be the step.
Yeah. And that you're not going to get. You might get that in Providence, but you're much more likely to get that in New York. But I'll ask the obvious question: could these strips happen today? Because I was just sitting outside in a cafe, and even groups of people sitting outside were all staring at their phones and not speaking to each other. And I don't know whether overheard dialogue, exists in the same way. What's your take? Do you
Well,
pay
there's 2
attention?
issues. Could I ever do it, too? And could it ever be done by anybody, given the fact that the digital world has taken over?
Yeah.
Exactly what you say. Screens of all sorts are what people relate to. So it's very hard for me to relate to somebody who's partly inside this screen.
Yeah.
I don't know how you could do it, but would it be as much fun? For a while, I did a series, Adweek-like comics for Media Post, which is an online ad site. Tried to do it, but it took 3 or 4 levels of corporate entities to get through to the art director, who I could call directly back in the day.
Sure.
I think the same thing would be true of any sort of real-life funnies. Now, people are uptight, they're nervous, they're money-oriented. That sounds very negative. I think it's just the nature of today. It's entirely different. Plus, I did raw stuff. Now, for all of the language of stand-up comics today, which is pretty rough,
Yeah.
still there's an acceptance of certain kinds of rawness that back then would be. There were certain kinds of rawness back then that would be shocking today.
Yes.
For all the rawness of
Which
today.
is what I asked at the beginning, if there were strips that you didn't include because this is going to offend. I didn't mean to offend anybody. People might get offended by,
Not so much that.
Okay.
because I didn't skimp when it came to offending.
Yeah.
There were a few, maybe you could say, still under my bed. But more, the weirdness. There were a few strips I did that I chose not to include because they just were too far out in the weirdness quotient to fit in a group like this, which is supposed to capture a more mainstream world of the 60s and 70s and 80s. There was some 60s in there, too. The revolution was still going on.
Sure.
But it was more about Con Ed. It was more about nuclear plants or more about Wall Street than it was about Vietnam and Nixon.
The post-real-life funnies life for you? You know, this ends 1995. We have another 29 years before I show up at your door.
I dropped out of my world. I was caregiving for my partner of 18 years, Janet Bodie, who got breast cancer. And from 95, which is the end of when The Voice jettisoned the strip, until the end of the millennium, the beginning of the millennium, till the end of that year, I was caregiving for her. And while we did some traveling, as she said, we bought a round the world ticket at one point. She said, maybe I can stay ahead of it. It won't catch up to me again. But it did. Yeah. So from 95, 96 on, I pretty much stopped doing everything. I was started a comic strip for the suburban section of the New York Times, which was Real Life Funnies for the Times, which had changed enough so that I could do that. And actually, I did a strip on the last weeks of her life that was so shocking, it drew horrified response from the suburban readers of the New York Times. Yeah. Some positive, but most horrified. And it was what got an editor to, caught the attention of an editor who thought, there's a book in here. Yeah. And so for the next few years, working with my then partner, Susan Champlin, now my wife, we created this memoir. So from 96 until 2005, I really wasn't doing much. I did a second strip for a online news site called Who, What, Why. And that was really, could Real Life Funnies be done with more of a political headset, which is where I am now, but still have the quality of the original strips. And that you can still find those online, but I stopped that after a couple of years. And then it was about trying to it was COVID, and it was trying to get interest in this collection, because at that point, Real Life Funnies was really old news. So many people were born since it, or who weren't around for it, that the idea of a book of what? Real Life Funnies was what? There was a lot of that.
It's weird. D.W. Young mentioned this when we talked about Uncropped, that documentary. You can't find old issues of The Voice. Like it's real tough to just find paper copies of it, and there's no digital archive. And
they're working on it.
He said he's hoping the new owners, really invest in that. But he said it's all those things. Those things should be, memorialized, and there really would be this ongoing, chronicle, I guess, of what the times were.
Jim Hamilton's movie, the Freaks book, Tricia Romano's book, this book, if it's seen as part of the recognition of the importance of The Voice, great. I'm not sure. It depends. I did get a great review at Publishers Weekly just 3 days ago. So that would be nice if all of that contributed to bringing The Voice back. It's very clear to me from the comments that Tricia's getting, there are an awful lot of journalists out there around the country who were around and sensitive to the freedom that the voice writers had. That they weren't experiencing wherever they were. So there's that going on.
Yeah, there's certainly a degree of, I would say, not realizing how good you had it, in certain respects, but also just what they were able to do with the freedoms they had.
Not to say they were unified. I mean, the fights that went on inside The Voice were as colorful as any on the outside. So the book is coming out, and we'll see if it helps in that way.
Mm-hmm. Do you look at your impact on the form of comics?
I'm fascinated by it,
Yeah.
to tell you the truth, because now, as we started to talk at the beginning, I'm looking back at this thing, which there was no role model for when
Yeah.
I started. When Milton said what he said, I did have my own newspaper experience, but as far as
No
I
one
knew,
was doing a comic strip of
I have
reportage.
Michael Dooley said, Harvey Kurtzman was doing that back a few years before you started. I'm not even sure. I haven't looked into that background, but there was nothing.
Yeah,
that
it's
I could
different.
point
And
to.
he was using artists. He wasn't drawing himself. Well, he wasn't doing his own drawings, so that's a little different.
A little different, and maybe Spiegelman and others did it in later years.
Yeah.
But no. So looking back and thinking, well, what is it? What's its role?
Yeah.
Can I go back in history and find out where the role models might have been? And I'm back to the Ashcan School. And we're talking about the United States. I mean, there were comics being done in Europe and Germany, especially, because there was an adult interest in comics in the way there never was in the United States. I don't think so. The Ashcan School of Painters, the Harlem Renaissance painters, the early comic strip guys like Harriman, were being sent out by newspapers at the turn of the century to cover events. The idea being eventually they would come up with characters and turn them into comic strips, which is what happened.
And the sports side of it, Eddie Campbell did that book, the Goat Getters. If you,
I just bought it. It's right behind you.
Good. Okay, because I was just going to say, as you're talking about it, I'm like, well, duh, that was where cartoonists were sent to cover events, but it was always within that sports context. And yeah, they were developing these ways of storytelling for news as opposed to a fictional comic strip that did create a little something different. But again, what you're doing is, or what you did over those decades, takes it in another direction that, again, I don't think anyone had
not using other
done.
people's words. These young
they
guys
were writing or reporting things as opposed to
and Harriman commented. He was a writer. He commented on those early assignments that he got as part of the drawing. The fact that I don't know what it means. The fact that I refuse to dare to add my words. What's that all about?
No. But there is a writing and a crafting that is integral to everything you're doing, and yet it's not a in your face overt Stan Mack persona, as opposed to Stan Mack's eyes and hands and what they're bringing you, I guess.
Maybe there's a tone that's there.
That's another thing I wondered, by the way, the dialogue, how you keep it from sounding like your memory of words and keep it sounding like actual individuals talking. How tough a challenge was that?
I didn't work at that.
No?
It's a combination today. You're right. You could say there's a tone to my strips that's not somebody else's. And I was always aware that, I've been close to a lot of writers. If anyone, regular, traditional reporters, if any of them went to cover what I covered, it would look nothing like mine. And that might also be true of cartoonists. So you're right. There was a writer in me that came out like Burroughs. He used to cut up newspapers and paste them together and come up with an original book. Somewhere in there is my personality. But on the face of it, however those lines got in there, it was pure instinct.
Always draw on paper, or did you ever try digital?
I tried with this comic I did for a while at Who What Why, the news site. I tried the iPad. Yeah. Partly because my drawing arm is not what it once was. Sure. It's just all that cross-hatching, man. And given my natural lack of strength in my backbone, I couldn't do that today. Yeah. So but the iPad, there was something about the iPad didn't really. It's like skating too fast on ice, not being able to control yourself.
You can put like a surface over it that gives it more toothiness, but I've never tried that for myself. I always worked with paper, but
there's something about a metal. Yeah. I view that now. I did nothing but choose a dip pen, a metal point, and something about that on paper, especially with a little tooth but not too much so it catches, is what made those drawings look like they look.
Oh, the buildings especially, I look at them and think, I only started drawing like 3 years ago, like I said, and I not good by any means, but there are moments I'm like, I get what that line is. Like I get just the flick and the little stretch that goes into this. I understand what he's doing and how he's doing. I don't understand how he's doing this every single week. For something that's just the background of not just, but is the background for what's meant to be the foreground of everybody's text.
By the way, I'm watching you use your left hand, your writing hand. Mm-hmm. That's what I do. So not only was I scratching with ink, I was smudging with ink.
Yeah, I was going to add, did you have to start from the bottom right and go all the way out?
This part of the hand is covered with ink all the time. And I would take this comic strip on deadline. Never was early. On deadline night. Go running from my apartment in the West Village to the center of the village where the Voice was. It was in 3 different places over the 20 years, but always somewhere in the middle. And it was almost like delivering a pizza. I used to think of it that way. Yeah. It's still hot before it got cold, and I'd load it up with all the ingredients that you like in a pizza. You go running over there and deliver it. But it was deadline night, and the lawyers were surrounding all the editors because the Voice was always being sued by some politician or other.
Right.
So closing night was hectic. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have time, it being so late, to go home and make any corrections. Nobody messed with me. Or any of the cartoonists.
Yeah, there's always it's just the comics. You can let that through.
Attitude in the voice. I don't know if it was just, but from Pfeiffer on, in some sense, and I don't even know if the Voice people would have agreed to this, the strips were untouchable. Yeah. Pretty much untouchable.
I just wonder whether it's the way nobody, I'll say, pays attention to the comics. Like they just think, oh yeah, whatever, it's the comics. We're focused on, we can get sued over the words. We're going to focus on this reporting or this columnist, but the comics are just the comics.
I had to be
not
sensitive.
Realizing that that's a thing that everybody's actually reading.
Well, that, I don't know if they'd ever acknowledge that. But although there's a very nice blurb from Joe Conason on the book, who was a voice, an important voice reporter.
Yeah. Anyway, so you're delivering them, and nobody was.
So there was nobody there to really read me. What I started to say was about lawyers. I was sensitive that there were problems that I could get into, and that was about libel. I couldn't have somebody recognizable in the strip because Jimmy Carter is in there. Yeah, there are people in there who are recognizable because my caricature talents are good enough. You would know that. But if they said something about somebody else who was recognizable, and I couldn't confirm that, then I was libelous. But comparatively, it was not a major deal. Anyway, if anybody, any copy editor, who I could grab and distract long enough to at least read this thing, and they found a misspelling, and an awful lot of misspellings in this book. Yeah. Although I think Fantagraphics tried to
clean up some of it. But yeah.
I brought with me white paint, little white out paint, and ink, and that same dip pen, and I would find somebody's empty desk to make whatever changes would be on. Sometimes I use rubber cement, which means that the originals, in some cases, patches have long fallen off because rubber cement dries and it's not cement anymore. So the originals are kind of complicated, but I had to quickly do that.
Yeah. And you were able to get all your originals back?
You
mentioned having stacks. I wasn't sure if those were all originals or photostats.
They are. And some I gave away, 1 or 2.
But you got them back from the Voice initially. I mean, they didn't hold on to your art or anything.
Yeah, the Voice, the art at the Voice, or the strips anyway, belonged to the artists. Yeah. There was a big issue back then among illustrators about who owned the original. This is mostly an advertising illustration, but I think it spread everywhere.
That's right. Within the comic book world, that was a big thing where Kirby never got his originals back and all this. But I had no idea from this world, from the Voice side, whether it was, oh yeah, we're done with your art, here it is.
That was never an issue with us at the Voice. The Voice, after all, was a progressive place.
No matter how progressive someone is, if they don't actually understand the value of things to other people, they can make mistakes.
Yeah, it's possible that they didn't understand the value at all, which is why I got it back.
Yeah. But out of all that, we managed to get this collection, which I'm inestimably thankful for.
Thank you.
Let me ask the big last question, which I should have warned you was coming. What are you reading?
Well,
anything jump to mind?
I'm reading Crazy, right behind your head.
Yeah. Oh, the Michael Tisserand book on
Tisserand.
Harriman?
And
I did a show with him. You can listen to that one from about 2016. I think I recorded with Michael for this.
That's brilliant. And it's also important to me. And the book you just mentioned, which I can't think of the name.
The Goat Getters?
The Goat Getters, right. Also behind your head.
I see.
And I'm reading Freaks, Trisha's book.
Yeah.
So those are the three that are... Oh, and Richard Kluger's The Paper. Richard Kluger was the editor of the book review section of the Herald Tribune when I was there. So he was the one I had to explain my designs to for the pages. It was my boss was Peter Palazzoli, as important a designer as Milton Glaser in his own way. They were contemporaries and friends.
Yeah.
But Kluger was the one who was the editor of a very progressive book review, one of the most important in the country at that, maybe the most important in the country at that time. And he then went on to a variety of other jobs when the Trib folded, which is why I went to the Times, and eventually wrote a book called The Paper, which is the history of the New York Herald Tribune, but also a history of the newspaper world of the United States starting before the Civil War, how it all came about. But ironically, in his book, as precise and as good a writer as Richard and researcher as he is, he wrote the Brown versus the Board of Ed, which is a hugely important book as well. I don't know that the word cartoon ever shows up in this book, and I was there.
That's what I'm telling you, man. They don't respect you guys.
He mentions Pulitzer. He mentions Hearst. If it weren't for Pulitzer and Hearst, those early comics wouldn't have existed because they understood who the reader was out there. But that was sensationalism. That was different.
But it was still, it was where the cartooning world started.
It was.
Anyway, we can gripe about people underestimating comics for, well, as I've done for 12 years now with the show. But Stan, I really want to thank you for A, for coming on, but B, for all the work you did we'll say creating your own form and creating this sort of visual reportage that, as we said, wasn't really a thing before you. So thank you for blazing a trail.
And may I say, I loved your questions. You were right on. You were there for a lot of them in that sense.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that was Stan Mack. Go get the new collection of Stan's work, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, the collected conceits, delusions, and hijinks of New Yorkers from 1974 to 1995. It's out now from Fantagraphics. It's a fantastic collection, an amazing chronicle of a whole bunch of eras of New York. And honestly, it is a landmark of cartooning. What he accomplished in that strip over so many years, well, we won't see the likes of it again. Not this sort of thing. Also, check out stanmack.com for more of Stan's comics, books, illustrations, updates on appearances, writing, and more. That is StanMack. He's also on Facebook as Stan Mack, on Instagram as Real Stan Mack, all one word. And he just started a YouTube channel, but it has a complicated URL. So don't worry. I'll have all the links to this stuff in the show and episode notes for this one. Also, you should sign up for his email list, which is on the stanmack.com site. Now, you can support this podcast by telling other people about it. Let them know that, except for an occasional hiatus, this podcast comes out every single week with really fascinating conversations with interesting cultural figures. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, or who you think I should record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition, whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, DM if we're on Instagram, by postcard or letter. I put my mailing address at the bottom of the newsletter that I send out twice a week, or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number. That's 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So you go longer than that, it'll cut you off. Just call back and leave another message. And let me know if it'd be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You may have something interesting to share with listeners, but I'd never run something like that without the speaker's permission. So, let me know. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. Not right now. I'm going to kickstart a book at the end of this year. That's when I want your money, so that we can pay for the production of it, and I can get you a fantastic book of photography and writing. But for now, give your money to other people or other institutions in need. With people, you can go through like Patreon, Kickstarter, GoFundMe, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, all those crowdfunding sites where you'll find people who need help making rent, covering medical bills, veterinary bills, car payments. They might have an artistic project they're trying to get off the ground. They might be in a position where if they can just get a few dollars from a couple of supporters, it'll make a real change in their lives. So, look for those and try and help people. And when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank every month, the World Central Kitchen. Sometimes I donate to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions, but I'm a lobbyist, so that's sort of part of my job. But for you, there's Planned Parenthood and women's choice funds, environmental funds, freedom funds. There are all sorts of things you can do if you got a few dollars to spare that'll help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.